Welcome to Ghost Education 101, where curiosity meets experience and the doors to the entire paranormal landscape are finally open. Hosted by Dr. Heather Leigh and Dr. Tiffany Frazier, this series is built for everyone who wants to understand the unexplained the right way. Whether you're just stepping into the unknown or you've been investigating for years, this is the place where you can sharpen your approach, deepen your understanding, and cut through the misconceptions that have overrun this field for far too long. Each episode walks you through the full spectrum of paranormal activity. Classic hauntings, intelligent spirits, cryptids, elemental beings, poltergeist phenomena, and the modern challenges investigators face today. We break it all down. The science, the method, and the mystery, without dumbing it down and without drifting into theatrics. Grounded in research, history, and real-world investigation, Ghost Education 101 is your classroom, your laboratory, and your gateway into the most compelling unexplained experiences on record. Learn, question, discover. Welcome to Ghost Education 101. Now, here are your hosts, Dr. Heather Leigh and Dr. Tiffany Frazier.
Good evening.
Good evening. Hey, Tiffany, how's it going tonight?
Pretty good. How are you?
Good, good. I'm excited about tonight's guest, but I know I say that every week, but each week we just keep getting better and better, don't we? I love all our guests, but this is this special guest joined Ghost Education 101 a couple years ago. Yeah. Has brought us great presentations, and I always look forward to a different perspective to the paranormal because not everybody thinks about the psychology side of what happens when you have paranormal experiences.
That's so true. Yeah, so, this is going to be a good one.
Yep, like I said, each episode gets better and better, but better and better in its own different and unique way. Mm-hmm. So I'm not going to waste any more time. I'm going to bring Kevin on board. Welcome back to the show. Kevin, how are you doing? Can you hear us?
I don't know why I can't hear you guys.
Uh-oh. This happens a lot.
I know.
And I always look for settings, and the settings are fine. So I'm not sure why this happens when
we had audio when he first joined.
We did, yeah.
iPhone, Mac, and AirPods. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me? I feel lost. You can hear me, but I can't hear anything.
Oh no. Should we have him?
And it says that my mic is unmuted.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let me see if he's reading chat.
Okay. We'll get it figured out, guys.
Did that catch his attention?
I logged out?
No.
In.
There we go.
Okay.
So anyway, while we're waiting for him to come back, next week we have a return guest from our psychic panel. Jay will be joining us again.
Okay.
I watched the psychic panel, loved it, but I just wanted to hear a little bit more from her. I wanted to hear what she had to say, so I invited her to come back.
Awesome. That'll be fun.
And then we have our cryptid panel after that. Can you hear us now?
Okay, I still can't hear anything, and I logged out and logged back on. And I think I lost my screen. Let's see.
I think this happened once before.
It has.
He's using AirPods, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I see an AirPod.
This is tough, guys. So sorry.
No, you're fine. Not that you can hear us. Because I think I had that once a couple years ago that someone using AirPods and it wasn't working.
Yeah. Oh, is he taking them out? Okay, let's try that.
Because that happened with Joe one time. But then we messed with him. We pretended we were talking and we weren't.
We did.
You may have to use computer audio. Okay, let me try that. Okay, hold on.
That's exactly what I was going to say to him. I was typing that.
And I see him trying it because he's on, I can see his share screen from his presentation.
Yeah, I can see that. We're trying, guys. So sorry about that.
Hold on, I'm going to try this
Might
again.
have to contact StreamYard tech and ask them what's going on.
Me.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Yes.
You can hear me okay? I still can't hear anybody.
Hey, let's try this.
Let's see.
I'm sending a quick message to help.
All right. It's not working even with that.
And
Okay. I guess what I can do is if everybody here, click on your settings, then on audio, and make sure the speaker's set for what you want.
While he's working on that, I'm just going to mention if anybody has any questions during the presentation, please make sure to ask. Another thing that I'm kind of curious about is we do have some open slots at the end of the year. So if anyone has anybody that they would like to be a special guest on our show that they'd like to see, or if they would be interested in being a special guest, reach out to us.
AirPods. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm doing that. I look and it has remove from stage, edit name, edit avatar, visual effects, stop mic.
okay, I see what he's cooking.
Okay. Okay, and we are working on this, guys. So please, please, please hang in there. I promise that we will get this up and running.
So unfortunate here. I'm so sorry, guys.
No, you're.
Click on the settings tab at the bottom.
Oops, I spelled that wrong. My bad.
Tab. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yes. And if he's on AirPods, then his audio. Yeah, audio.
I can make his screen bigger unless you can see it clearly.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah. His speaker is okay. His speaker is on audio.
Okay,
the
speakers are working.
Okay.
Can you hear us?
No, all right. Can you hear me?
Yes, yep. We can. Yep.
Yeah, it looks like it's not letting me kind of get started here, and I don't know why. Okay, I could do that. I tried. Let's do that again. The audio and I'm going to put the Mac. Okay. Can everybody hear me?
We can hear you.
Oh, okay. I hear you. Oh, gosh,
okay. Okay.
We did. All right. I'm going to take
Perfect. I hear an echo now. Uh-oh.
Let's see. That's the part I was concerned about. How about now?
Perfect.
Yep. We're good.
Okay. And my echo's gone. So. All right.
So welcome to the show, Kevin.
Oh, gosh. Okay. Yes, somewhat. 10 minutes later. I appreciate that. I'm so sorry.
No, you're fine. I got some of the end of the show stuff out of the way while you were fidgeting around with that and getting it to work. So we're good.
Okay, so what's
So,
next? Do I go ahead and just pop up the share tab?
yeah, I would. The only thing is we do have a lot of new viewers. I
Oh,
don't
okay.
know if any of them know who you are. If you can take just a moment, unless it's in your presentation, but if
It
you can take
is.
a
It
moment to
is.
explain who you are. Oh, it is in there?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Okay, perfect.
it's all in there, and I will kind of discuss how we're going to do the format, and I just got it. It's not a lengthy presentation, but
Mhm.
it does have a lot of info.
Okay.
But pen and paper just to write down some stuff, and I'm going to
Mhm.
break it down in 3 segments. So it's about 10 minutes each segment.
Okay.
Take maybe a few questions, but not too many at the moment, and then
Mhm.
towards the end, when I finish the third segment, we can just open it up for just Q&A, comments, or sharing stories or what have you.
Okay. So what I'll do is I'll just save all the comments and questions that people have, and then when you're ready to take them, let me know and we'll clear those out, and then we'll
Okay,
move forward. So whenever you're
wonderful.
ready.
I am ready, so I click, right? Do I click on the, let's see, hold on. Here we go. All right, can everybody see this or?
It's still on your screen that shows the StreamYard
Oh,
link.
okay, let's see. Well, what do I do now? Hold on. Slideshow. Oh, okay, all right, hold on.
I was going to say, if not, we can stop sharing your current screen and then start from scratch if you want to.
I've been here sort of in the beginning. I'm not sure where. Let's see. No, I want to go back. Can you see that?
Now, right now, all we're seeing is the StreamYard screen still.
Okay. So how to. All right. Okay, so I'm gonna kind of just step out here. Let's see. All right. So the last time I think I was now you can see me, right? So
Mhm.
all right. So at this point, if I could just share. Hmm, I don't see it now. This is what I wanted you guys to see.
Mhm.
Can you see that?
When you pop it open, because right now we just see the screen from StreamYard.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
I thought
Maybe
I
if you go to the top and do stop sharing and then start from scratch again.
Yeah.
okay. All right. So let's do that. Hold on. Okay. So then. All right. There's a button on the top that says share. And do I invite people?
No, that's if you want to share it on your social media. So we gotta somehow stop. Let me kick this out from the studio and stop your screen
Yeah.
sharing. Oh shoot!
Try
I just
that.
kicked him out.
Oh no. Oh no.
I,
Oh, the universe is really screwing with us tonight. What's going on?
oh, God. I knew when I got home from work, I should have just gone to bed. Hopefully he comes back. At least I didn't hit ban from studio. I just hit remove. I was thinking I was removing his screen share. I didn't think I was kicking him out.
Oh no. He'll come back, I'm sure.
He'll probably think he did something wrong.
Oh.
There he is. I was about to email him. Sorry about that. I just kicked you out on accident trying to stop you from sharing.
Let me see. Okay, let's see if I share screen, share, allow to share windows.
There we go. Yep, and then just
Awesome.
hit
There it is.
slideshow, and that should take you to the full thing.
Okay, now I can't see anybody, so so if you just let me know about the chats, and again, my apologies for this stuff.
Yep, no problem.
Okay, I'm just going to start, and like I said, this is going to be probably about 3 segments, and they're about 10 minutes apart. The first one is going to be a little bit more lengthy, but this is creating a safe zone for experiencers seeking mental health services. Now, just to share a little bit about myself, my name is Kevin Quiles, and I have been a psychotherapist for, I would say, over 11 years now. And before that, I actually served in hospice for 15 years. Um, and so I've been working out there in the field for quite some time in different capacities. But what I do want to mention is that this is an educational presentation. This isn't therapy. And I want just to sort of contract with you, I want you as an audience to really take responsibility, and whatever you hear tonight, I would want you to verify the information and talk about it with either your therapist or your doctor or whoever, and never make any kind of changes when it comes to your mental health just by hearing a presentation. So this is just an educational piece. What I want you to do is just to write down questions as they come along, because I do it this might be new to some of you, and so I want to take it slowly, but at the same time I feel that this is really something I'd like to empower you with, so that if you are seeking some services, you're not just going to walk in passively and just take whatever they say to you, but you will have conversations with the professional in a way that would empower your treatment. So as for me, like I said, I started out a long time ago in a full-time residency program, and I did that at a psychiatric hospital for 9 months. It was a full-time residency. And then from there, I moved into hospice chaplaincy, and that I did that for 15 years before I entered the field of psychotherapy. I've traveled a little bit, and I traveled twice to India, and I did that for training. And the reason why I mention it is because I think it really added to my work as a psychotherapist. I went one time to Varanasi for a meditation retreat. It was a 10-day meditation retreat. And then I went to Rishikesh, which is the yoga capital of the world, or so. That's how they sort of understand themselves there, and learn Kundalini Yoga. So my website is in the bottom there, so you can always learn more about me, about my work. I do psychotherapy and have been doing psychotherapy in Georgia for the last 11 years. Okay, so what I want to do here is let me make sure, okay. What I want to do here is I just want to share with you what the objectives are going to be. So I want to demonstrate a few things. One, I want to demonstrate that a biased beginning, shaky standards of research and practice, and unsubstantiated claims of an empirically based model of mental illness. Mainstream psychiatry and its text, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and I'll refer to that as the DSM, are less of an authority. I also want to share with you that traditional psychiatry and neuropsychology utilize a narrow epistemology that dismisses how other cultures and spiritual traditions see and understand the world. And then I want to share, the last part is going to be knowing what to look for. You as an experiencer, especially if you're seeking help when there are some severe reactions, you can still utilize and benefit from the mental health system. You just need to know what questions to ask and what to look for. The outline is the same. We're going to look at a glimpse into a beginning of mainstream psychiatry. We're going to look, secondly, to ontology and epistemology, the hidden oppressors. And then last, we'll look at finding the right professional, knowing what to look for. So let's look at a glimpse into a beginning of mainstream psychiatry. I think it's important for you, if you're an experiencer, you want to know this and you want to understand this so you know what or who you're working with. If you're a therapist, it's doubly important for you to understand this and to be well versed in how to have conversations about why we feel that there is a need for an expansion within the field. So, what later came to be known as psychiatry originated in the 1800s, and it was led by a group of European men or males, and later a few women. And they were seeking to explain human behavior using a specific ontology and epistemology. Now, I'll come back to that in the second segment, but I want you just to catch a glimpse of what that looked like. Now, during this time, remember that Black men, women, and children were not seen as fully human, and women were treated as weaker. So I want you just to watch and notice that pattern, that men are getting together to understand a very complex process, but in doing so, they've already eliminated two very, very important groups. In 1844, psychiatry was considered a medical specialty by the Association of Medical Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane. Now, that was a load of words there, which later became the American Psychiatric Association. So, what this is really saying is that the APA, or the American Psychiatric Association, pretty much self-ordained itself. And then they combined, in this time period, they combined these mental processes with biological diseases. In other words, they were trying to understand the human behavior, the subjective, alongside of understanding biological diseases. Now, there's a book that came out, and you don't have to remember this, but I would encourage therapists to even get a copy just to see what it looked like. But there's the Statistical Manual for the Use of Institutions for the Insane, which was published in 1917 or 18. And that book is a very thin book, but it talks a lot about psychosis, which is something I think that we need to look at as we discuss experiences, unusual phenomena. But this book is very small, and you could see the language developing even as far back as when it was published. You could see things like, and they often talked about psychosis with mental deficiency, they called it, psychosis with the nervous system. And it kind of goes on and on. Much of it is around psychosis. But you can see a development that I want you to remember, because when we get to 1980, something is going to happen with the DSM, as you know what that is now. Something happened where something became very official, and the way that psychiatry, mainstream psychiatry, would look at itself became the dominating theme of how they would function. Now, while they were sort of like exploring these processes and trying to combine biological diseases and the body and the subjective and human experiences, right? Psychiatrists, they began to sort of try to understand what is normal. How do we define what is normal? And it amounted to supporting normalcy as defined by the dominant culture. So naturally, you would want to sort of look and see, okay, how do we apply this to society, to the culture? But what happened was something interesting was kind of twisting here. And that is that while they were looking at culture, psychiatry here in a number of places began to support the normalcy of the dominant culture. And that becomes a little bit questionable. And here are a few examples. During slavery, Samuel Cartwright, who was a physician practicing in Mississippi around 1822 to 1848, determined that a slave who desired to run away from his owner suffered mentally from drapetomania. Now just think about that for a moment, that here were some men who were exploring human behavior trying to understand and support society to kind of find this measuring rod of normalcy. And they looked at us at a slave who desired to run, and instead of sort of trying to say this isn't right or this isn't how we understand people should relate to one another, they looked at the slave as the one having the mental illness, suffering a mental illness called drapetomania. Another example is during World War II, under the German regime, psychiatrists euthanized or felt they had to euthanize mentally ill patients who didn't fit the Nazis' definition of a master race. Now, Strauss was one who brought this to light and he's written some articles around this. Now, I have in parentheses that they felt they had to, and Strauss is he makes it a point to say that the psychiatrist may not have had much of a choice, and that one can see that. On the other hand, I'm not sure if there's enough information to make that kind of conclusion. What I do know is that some of these psychiatrists eventually came to the U.S. and they became professors at universities, and some of them were they had their names and identity hidden. But it's interesting to understand that in this situation, what psychiatrists struggled with. Third, during or around the civil rights protests, psychiatrists working in the asylum for the criminally insane in Ionia, Michigan, eventually ascribed the diagnosis of schizophrenia to Black men. Now, that's a very important piece here, because in that, schizophrenia was also termed dementia precox. But it eventually became, in this particular asylum, they began to ascribe schizophrenia to Black men. Now, again, you may wonder, okay, we're hoping to find a very solid beginning, and we find that what became mainstream psychiatry started off with a form of ontology and epistemology that wasn't necessarily fair. And we'll talk more about what that looked like. Now we're looking at how they interacted with culture. And we see that instead of sort of trying to understand the human experience, there was this sense in which there was an ascribing of mental illness to Black men here. And in this sense, it was schizophrenia. Now, you would think, like, when a Black man would come to the asylum, that a Black man talked about, and I think that Metzel points this out, that there was a Black man that talked about people chasing him or lying about him. And the psychiatrist would just automatically write in his notes, paranoia. And little did the psychiatrist even pause to understand that the possibility of a Black man feeling like people are chasing him or lying about him was a very real thing, because Black men were being lynched and they were being lied about either in court or by police. But that wasn't taken into account. And so this becomes a place of struggle. What was happening to what later was known as mainstream psychiatry when this sort of twist and turn is taking place, and it doesn't feel like we're looking at things from, as best as we can, from an objective perspective. Now, Jonathan Foyles wrote a book called Misdiagnosed, and he states that schizophrenia and even drapetomania became a type of policing Black men or controlling Black men. Now, there are some who will be very strong in their charge against what eventually took place early in what later became known as mainstream psychiatry. But I prefer not to go there, even though sometimes the appearances might look questionable. But there are some who are very strong in their charge against the way that psychiatry was maneuvering back in the early days. And then there's the place of during a period in history when shows like Father Knows Best was about to air in 54. A couple of years earlier, the first DSM of 1952 officially pathologized homosexuality as a neurosis. Now, I want you to hear that again. What is happening? It feels like psychiatry is more or less supporting the dominant culture as opposed to working to create a healing environment for all. And homosexuality was removed from the DSM in 1973. That's what, some 20, almost 20 years ago. And it didn't come without, until there were people that were really protesting this. So now jumping to the DSM-3 in 1980. So you have neurosis, and you heard me use that word. Neurosis was dwindling because early on, the work of Sigmund Freud and neurosis was rather dominant for a few decades. But at the same time, there was another camp in which there was a sense in which psychiatry was longing to sort of be understood as a medical specialty. And in fact, they sort of classified themselves as such, which has a very strong medical feel to it. And so by the time the DSM-3 came, there was also some pressure from insurance that the work of neurosis, the psychoanalytic approach, was not serving the need for insurance to demonstrate that there's evidence for reimbursement. And so what you have here is that you have not only neurosis and the philosophy of psychoanalysis, but insurance pressuring psychiatry. So it's about this time that the description of a mental disorder having a biological cause becomes official. Now, that is huge. Now, it's not to say that that wasn't hinted upon in the past, because schizophrenia was considered a brain disease by the 1960s. But it is in 1980 on the third DSM where you have the words that a mental disorder has a biological cause, which later which has the idea that there's a brain dysfunction or something that is not normal in the brain. But there was a bit of a concern, because at the same time, the DSM-3 talked about that for most of the disorders that are in the DSM-3, the cause is unknown. So we're starting to see some sort of a tension that on the one hand, that mainstream psychiatry was starting to say that there is a biological cause for mental disorders. In other words, there is something abnormal or a brain dysfunction of some kind, or a chemical imbalance, as you've heard probably lots of times. But we don't know what those causes are. So it's almost like saying there is something wrong, but we don't know what. Now, Robert Spitzer, who played a crucial role in the making of the DSM-3 and the DSM-3R, stated in an interview with James Davies, who is an author of the book Cracked, and it's a worthwhile reading. Robert Spitzer said that there are no biological markers or causes for most of the diagnoses in the DSM. Again, emphasizing that on the one hand, mainstream psychiatry is now claiming that a mental disorder has a biological cause. On the other hand, they're saying but we don't know what those causes are for most of the disorders in the book. So, on the one hand, mental disorders, that many, if not most of the mental disorders have a cause, but the cause is unknown. On the other hand, mainstream psychiatry is now understanding itself as a medical specialty, which gives the impression that the practice is based on empirical research. So there's this tension that mainstream psychiatry has not been able to solve. But is the DSM-3 empirically based? Now, Spitzer developed what was first called, because I want you to see, this is sort of an example of where the lack of research is really not, it doesn't support what mainstream psychiatry was wanting the public to understand, and that is that they are a medical specialty. But Spitzer developed what was first called brief reactive psychosis. It's now called brief psychotic disorder. And this is important because you hear the word psychosis in a pathological way a lot in today's world, especially when working with experiencers. Spitzer had a 40-minute conversation with two psychiatrists who were working in the same hospital. And after hearing them talk about their observations of two types of patients with reported psychotic features, Spitzer asked for a typewriter and constructed two disorders: the brief reactive psychosis, and then the second one was factitious disorder. And they're both in, though different names, they're both in the current DSM. But what was Spitzer doing here? And is this something that looks like an empirically based text? Is this something that demonstrates impressive research? And that's something that I think something that I think needs to be explored and discussed. So the DSM-3 describes it as when we talk about what a mental disorder is, the DSM-3 describes it as a significant behavioral or psychological syndrome or pattern in the individual, which then causes an impairment. And so it is different than a disease, right? Because when you go to a doctor, you talk about a disease. A disease is a measurable physical condition with an identifiable cause. But here we see mainstream psychiatry trying to really identify with really the medical field. But in doing so, not only do they not know what the causes are for the mental disorders that are in the DSM, but they're also struggling to even understand what a mental disorder is. There's a gentleman by the name of Alan Francis who is the author of the book Saving Normal. And he was a contributor of the DSM-4. And he stated that psychiatry has not clearly defined a mental disorder. And when you look at what I just read, even though it was paraphrasing, the definition of a mental disorder is quite vague. Now, in an interview that was transcribed in Wire magazine with Gary Greenberg, who is a psychotherapist, and he wrote a book called The Book of Woe and Manufactured Depression. Alan Francis said in that interview, there is no definition of a mental disorder. It's bullshit. I mean, you just can't define it. It has been a struggle and continues to be a struggle to this day to understand what exactly do you mean when you say a mental disorder. So if you can picture everything I just said, because I know I threw a lot of really like textbook type info, and I don't want to lose you, but if you look at everything that I just said, there's a sense in which what would later be known as mainstream psychiatry began with an ontological and epistemological approach. And it was one that was not, that dismissed really the ontology and epistemology of other cultures and other groups. At the same time, there was this need or this sense in trying to understand mental illness with biological diseases. And eventually, by the time 1980 came, there was a sense in which the mainstream psychiatry was claiming that a mental disorder has a biological cause, only we don't know what those causes are. Unlike a doctor who can locate when there is a heart disease or when there's diabetes or when there's cancer, they can look at the organs, they can study it, and there is an identifiable cause. What I tend to look at is that there is this thing where, do we need to understand mental suffering as a mental disorder, i.e., as something that has a biological cause such as a brain dysfunction? Do we need to understand mental suffering in that light? Joanna Moncrief, she wrote a book called Chemically Imbalanced, a very, very good text. But she emphasized that there was a time when circumstances and choices of lifestyle and unhealthy regulating of emotions were understood as factors leading to mental suffering. And there are a number of us in the field who don't draw to the DSM for the very reason that I just described. It doesn't have the authority that it is presented to the public. But there are plenty of ways of understanding mental suffering that doesn't have to equate to a biological cause. All right, so let me stop here. And I don't know if you have a couple of questions that we can take right now, and then I'll proceed.
Yeah, no questions have come through yet. Tiffany, do you have any before we continue? I don't have any yet.
I do have one that came up while he was talking, but I think I want to save it to the end because I want to see what else he has to say. Maybe I'll add to what I wrote down.
Okay. All right. So let me move on then. All right. So then hidden oppressors. So I want to just show a little bit about what I mean about ontological and epistemological approaches. Now, over the years, it looks like mainstream psychiatry has worked hard to try to sort of correct content. I struggle with some parts of it still, but for the most part, there are many good psychiatrists, psychologists, and therapists who mean well even when using the DSM, and many good psychiatrists who are trying to improve the DSM. But they have never been able to get to the place of demonstrating conclusively that a mental disorder has a biological cause. And so that's a huge problem, and they admit it. And it's admitted by a number of psychiatrists. They understand that a cause is unknown, but yet they make the leap as if they are presenting something to be of fact, right, of science. Now, when it comes to ontologies and epistemological approaches, right, there was this bias in the beginning, a bias by these men who were gathering and trying to understand reality, trying to interpret reality, and trying to explain reality. But their line of reasoning was very different, and over time, it was very dismissive of other groups and cultures, and still is to this day. Back then, and some of this you can still see today, there was more of a linear reasoning, which superseded emotions. There was a sense in which reasoning sort of was a priority over emotions. Emotions were not seen uh, as something of equal importance. There was naturally the cause and effect, A causes B. There was a sense of the subject object where there was a sense of separation. That for me to understand you or nature, I had to see objects, something separate from me. There was reductive thinking, and there was material over the immaterial. In other words, there was no such thing as spirit, God, that sort of thing, right? Freud's projection or illusion concepts. So, and then there was this hierarchy in the very beginning, men over women. Black men and women were not considered fully human. So, psychiatry, at least back in those days, was developing a way of knowing and a way of understanding the world and mental suffering, but from their perspective and from a line of reasoning that was very foreign to other groups and cultures and spiritual traditions. So that, like in other cultures, there was a sense of interconnection. They understood the world and themselves as part of a whole. And it had material and immaterial properties. And so there was a sense in which there was no need to even divide the material and the immaterial, as if like what we do here today. Do you believe in God or do you believe in spirit? Theirs was a sense of complexity in which you could not reduce their sense of reality. And then there was a sense of a both and. So there was this sort of sometimes even paradoxical thinking rather than an either or type of logic. And then at other times, there was this circular reasoning. And it was less about time and space. In fact, sometimes that would either fade to the background because there was this sense in which we are all present. Our ancestors, for example, were understood as present. That's why you have groups today. Marimba Ani points out in her book, Yurugu, that there's a sense in which their ancestors are present. They speak that way because there's a sense in which time is time is a construct, but time is not something by which they understand their reality. And so there's a sense in which the way that psychiatry began was forming a way of understanding reality in which many groups and many cultures could not identify with. And so Western psychiatric epistemology involves that all the other cultures within proximity, right? Because lots of these cultures are represented here in the US, but that these other cultures were really, in order to sort of like deal with mental suffering, they had to adapt to this version of reality that was formulated long ago, and it didn't make sense to them. They didn't understand mental suffering and reality the same way that these men did when they were putting together this way of dealing with mental health. And so this sets at a disadvantage Native nations, African, Black and Brown communities, and Latin cultures who have this interconnected worldview that includes the material and an autonomous immaterial. Now, one area where there is this specialized area is in the form of neuroscience. You hear a lot today about neuroscience, and it is a very important field. And so, but in doing so, neuroscience follows that more materialistic Western epistemology, which doesn't allow for alternatives that are represented in other cultures. For example, many, if not most, neuropsychologists understand that the brain produces the mind. And when the brain dies, the mind dies. So much of human experience is reduced to or explained by neurons, neurotransmitters, and chemical processes. Right? I have the example of Jules Evans. He's written a number of books, and he has studied a lot on the mystic and mysticism. And I'm not sure if more of a historian or philosopher, but he had an interview with a young man, and the young man was having a spiritual crisis. And this young man was talking about the time in which he was really struggling. And then at one point, he decided to go see a psychiatrist. And the young man describes the psychiatrist as a very kind person, a gentleman. But when he started talking about his struggle and his belief in God, the psychiatrist looked at the young man and said, "Do you know that if I touch a certain part of your brain, you will believe in God?" And so that's an example, first of all, that's questionable. I don't even know if the psychiatrist ever did that. I don't know anything about the psychiatrist. And at the same time, there are some ethical questions around that. But the point here is that there is this reducing effect, and neuroscience can sometimes take the role of almost making the human experience mechanical. Sometimes you might hear some in the field talk about your personal truth. Their psychologists might talk about your personal truth, but in some cases, all that means is it's all in your head. That's all what's happening in the brain. Now, there are interesting theories of an expanded kind of consciousness, right? There's the near-death experiences, there's precognition, there's an expanded awareness of being stared at without any obvious sensations at play. There's the intuitive knowing, and there's the old Buddhist teaching of the I or the self that observes personal thoughts, feelings, and experiences, right? So when we're meditating and we are noticing sensations, we are noticing thoughts pass our minds, we're noticing feelings, the question becomes, who is noticing? Who is the one that is observing? So to me, a refusal to entertain a more expanded view of the mind, to honor epistemological diversity, seemed to have more to do with controlling the interpretation of the studies so that they remain aligned with mainstream psychiatric and psychological tradition. Another factor that is at play with neuropsychologists, and this is important also with regard to unusual phenomena, but there's this often cause and effect. A causes B. But when it comes to the brain, when initial or supposedly initial brain activity is detected, does that mean that the motion is causal? How do we know it's causal? The brain is so complex. Even an understanding of the chemicals and the hormones and the transmitters, everything that goes on with the brain is so complex that it's really risky to make simplified conclusions. But how do we know that when we see brain activity that one is a cause? Could the brain be participating with something else? Something external or autonomous yet immaterial? So that, say for example, if I say I experienced God, was it just some brain activity that was going on? Was it the God spot that some people have talked about, such as the psychiatrist who said, if I touch the brain, you will believe in God? Or could it be that there is something outside of me that is participating with my mind, with my brain. All right. So now, again, any questions or comments?
We did have one comment from Ginger. She had said, something tells me Kevin is a fan of Isaac Preleltensky and Dennis Fox.
Oh, why is that? Why is that?
I'm not sure. She didn't elaborate.
I hope she does. I hope she does.
And I had a question, but you answered it with your second slide after that. So I don't know if Tiffany has any. I was basically wanting to know, when you were talking about the brain dies, the mind dies, if that defeated or contradicted all survival of human consciousness studies and beliefs.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Because right, and that's it, the concept that the mind is a product of the brain, and that when the brain dies, the mind dies. It certainly negates the immaterial or ongoing consciousness, right? And we see people talking about how they have either, they were declared dead clinically, or they were under such anesthesia. I think of a story of a woman. I saw this, and I forgot where it was because I want to give it reference, but where the woman was kayaking and she was underwater for 20 minutes, but she could see what was going on above the water. Mm-hmm. And so there's a sense in which, there is some pull to this, right? That even though we can't explain it, there's some pull. But neuroscience is so Western epistemologically driven that it dismisses the immaterial. Yep. It doesn't allow for that. And so this is important because when we talk with say, a psychologist or a neuropsychologist, or with a psychiatrist, we have to understand that while they are well-meaning folk, they're good people, they're going to hear the story of the experiencer from a very different perspective. Mm-hmm. The client, the experiencer, will come in and will be talking about, I had this experience happen to me. They will be hearing it, number one, from an epistemological approach that dismisses the immaterial. They will not be looking at it from the same angle as the experiencer, and there will be no place for that narrative to be then transformed and utilized to help the client live with the story and use it to grow and advance in life. They will just simply think, this is happening in your head. Mm-hmm. And we're going to get into psychosis in just a minute. But then what happens is that there is this sense in which the whole process of pathologizing the experience, because mainstream psychiatry basically says these things don't happen, therefore it is pathology, it is psychosis, it is delusional, it is hallucinations. They call it everything. But again, remember, their epistemological approach is geared to deny the experiencer from the very start.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. And I mean, we could talk about it later too, after all of this, but I had a similar experience to what you just mentioned about her being underwater and knowing what was happening above water. Mm. But mine was, I went into surgery at 6 years old and I was unconscious going into surgery. And I could tell everybody what happened in that room while they were doing the surgery, because I remember seeing it happening as it was going on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. See, that's incredible. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's incredible. Yeah. Yeah. And you hear of stories, and Bruce Grayson points, he's a psychiatrist. He wrote the book After, where he really captures and studies the near-death experiences. You hear of that. Now I'm okay to sort of like look at some of the material from a skeptic standpoint, because we don't just want to jump and say, oh, look, there's the evidence. Right. No, but at the same time, what does neuroscience do with this stuff?
Mm-hmm.
And they just don't give it a place. Now, I've taken some courses around neuroscience because some are like, this is the big thing for, for mental health. This is the big thing, the next big step.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked the teacher, does neuroscience and do neuropsychologists believe that the mind is a product of the brain, and when the brain dies, the mind dies? And he said that is actually a major debate today
Mm-hmm.
in the field. So there are some that, not everybody, not every neuropsychologist concludes that when the brain dies, the mind dies. I don't know what percentage does and what percentage doesn't, but it's nice to know that there's an opening, and I feel that that is so important. What makes this whole thing about uh, uh, the ontology and epistemology, what makes it oppressive is that it automatically dismisses the experience of other groups and cultures and spiritual traditions who see that there is such a thing as ongoing consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And
Okay.
so, wouldn't it be nice to see that perhaps the model might be that mainstream psychiatry may make room to where people, experiencers, and people from other groups and other tribes can receive help from mental suffering without negating their experience or their sense of reality.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yep. And Ginger actually got back to us real quick before we continue. She says what she meant was, it seems like you might be interested in critical or radical psychology. She can appreciate anyone who thinks outside the box and challenges the status quo.
Thank you. Yeah, totally. And I always try to find a way to present this information in a way that's really like simple, but I sometimes struggle with that because you can't help but move into some dense material and to jargon that is difficult to sort of grasp. But it's important that we look at this information and understand the beginnings of what later became mainstream psychiatry, and to understand that it really, there's a presentation in the public that mainstream psychiatry is a medical specialty, but there's a lot of struggle, and there's not the conclusive, consistent research to back up the theories that they have presented to demonstrate that, you see, we have a cause for depression, or we have a biological cause for schizophrenia, or we have a biological cause for anxiety. To this day, decades and decades later, they still struggle with that. But the public is under the impression that it is a medical science.
Okay. Yep.
All right. So I'm going to move now on to the piece of psychosis. Knowing what to look for in a professional. Now, the reason why I mention psychosis is because that is, when an experiencer has an encounter, sometimes there's suffering, sometimes there's struggles. Now, the good news is that in light of everything that I said, that there are psychiatrists, there are psychologists, and there are therapists who are sympathetic to the experiencer. They want to provide the kind of care that you need and that you want. These are some things that you can look for, because remember, you don't want to be passive when you're looking for somebody, and you don't want to be passive in your treatment. You want to ask questions. You want to co-create a treatment plan. And these are some things that you can look for, or you can formulate these into questions. But this is what I would look for. These professionals who are sympathetic to the experiencer, they recognize that conclusive and consistent evidence to explain mental suffering as a brain dysfunction or abnormality is lacking. 2, they see mind and brain as distinct but working together, the former carrying both local and expanded properties. 3, they recognize that unusual experiences occur and that they carry transformational potential even when unusual encounters bring with them transient, yet sometimes severe symptoms to credible and well-functioning individuals. 4, they are aware that while in some cases mental suffering might explain a reason for an unusual report, they also recognize that in some or perhaps many cases, suffering such as trauma, depression, anxiety, or even a history of psychotic episodes are not automatically the cause for unusual phenomena. Why? Because such events are understood in and of themselves to occur. 5, they understand that both a history of mental suffering and unusual phenomena can legitimately coexist side by side. And last, they have an expanded view of psychosis, namely that it could reflect or be a part of the unusual phenomena, such as in mystical experiences, spiritual crises, or as Stanley and Christina Groff called it, spiritual emergency. There's altered states, there's trance, spirit possession, out of body. That psychosis is not just about representing hallucinations. That's the traditional approach. That's mainstream psychiatry. I'm suggesting here, and I think others have suggested it in different ways of saying it, but what I'm suggesting is that some of us understand psychosis not just to consist of hallucinations, but as sometimes reflective of or part of the unusual phenomena. Now, for me, and I say this because if an experiencer came to me, he or she is entitled to informed consent. He or she should know what I believe. Psychosis has been poorly defined by mainstream psychiatry. But it's important for the experiencer to wonder if they're going to look for someone to help. It's important for them to know what is your understanding of psychosis? Like what's your definition of psychosis? Lots of times you'll hear the word psychosis, psychotic, and people are tossing that term all the time. And the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. There's no camaraderie. There's no understanding. It's almost like we almost accept the word without asking, wait a minute, what are you actually saying when you use the word psychosis? And it is important for the experiencer to know from the therapist, from the psychologist, from the psychiatrist, what is your definition of psychosis? Now, for me, I hold to a twofold definition. One is a shift from one reality to another, where the distinction of the two can be temporarily blurred. The actual shift carries imagery, sound, symbol, perception, and a felt sense that are related to or a part of the experience, and that can produce transient suffering. So that involves an encounter, the reality from one to another. The second definition is a shift from reality into what seems to be another reality, but leaves the person feeling fragmented. The shift contains imagery, sound, symbol, perception, and a felt sense that can still be effectively maneuvered toward integration and functionality with support, the support of other people. And so that second definition allows for that sense in which sometimes mental suffering can produce what we think is real, but it's not. It kind of goes back to that more traditional sense, but it does so very carefully. The first one has more to do with these reactions that take place, these sort of a sense of psychosis, but it's occurring within the frame of moving from one reality to another. And it doesn't dismiss the encounter. It doesn't dismiss the experience. Now, on the second one, it's important for people to know this, because psychosis is so mixed up with under the schizophrenia spectrum. But in truth, there have been, back in the 60s, like I said, there was a sense in which mainstream psychiatry was understanding schizophrenia as a brain disease. You see that push again into the biological cause. But the evidence, the conclusion, there's been no conclusive evidence for that. And there are places where you can argue about the dopamine and about the brain volume to demonstrate that there's no consistent evidence for that. The other beautiful thing is that there are a number of studies where a percentage of people who have been diagnosed with schizophrenia, they actually recover, and they do so without medication. And so that in itself, again, really challenges this sort of biological model. But some sources, if there's anybody out there who wants to look into this and study more about how to help someone who has been diagnosed with schizophrenia, there's so much conversation about, neuroleptics or antipsychotic meds that can be so harmful. Here are some places where you may want to go. There's a network called the Hearing Voices Network. And this is a really good network of people who have been diagnosed with schizophrenia and deal with the voices that they hear. But they've developed a relationship with the voices. They don't consider themselves as mentally ill. They work with the voices that they have, and they're successful. I went and I did I think it was 6 days worth of training. And I sat at the feet of these folks, and these were some beautiful, beautiful people. And they shared how they learned to understand the voices and to relate to the voices. And sometimes in the very middle of the class, they would say, I'm hearing one of the voices right now. They've learned how to successfully regulate and manage their experiences. Then there's a book, How to Become a Schizophrenic by John Muldrow. I think it's now in its 3rd edition. A very good text that demonstrates, and he struggled as well with the illness, but he ended up demonstrating how it is not a brain disease. It doesn't fit that biological model that mainstream psychiatry has wanted to put it in. And then I think most of you probably know about the Beautiful Mind, the movie Beautiful Mind. I found that movie fascinating, and how he learned to understand how to work with his internal experiences. And he used accountability. Do you see what I am seeing? And there were supportive people around him. They say that there are other countries that are more successful than we are when working with someone who has been diagnosed with schizophrenia. France, Italy, India, and there are others. Why? There is this sense of community. They're not in isolation. We here in the US, we're very individualized. But in other countries, they all kind of as a community help the person, make them feel a part of, because isolation is very, very huge when people are suffering like this. Okay, so then I would also share what my model is. I don't know if you can see the little arrow that I'm moving, but I would also want to share this with the experience. This is how I understand my work. I work very much with the unconscious, and this is how I understand. And I share with them. This little arrow above here is the conscious mind, and then everything below is the unconscious. And I am a diehard believer that the unconscious governs more of our behaviors and our experiences than we think. However, I go beyond this. A lot of I was going to say approaches, but things like humanistic psychology, psychoanalysis, there are people that do not subscribe to the biological model of the DSM, but they will only say that this is all they're working with, the unconscious and the conscious mind. I include the more expanded mind. And in this expanded mind, people can have experiences on a conscious level, such as, did you hear that? I heard something. Or did you see that? I saw something. And then also, there's a sense in which, and also in the conscious level, there's also a place where it's like, I sense something and I can't tell you what it is. Something feels, and they go on to describe it. On an unconscious level, where a lot of stuff works, there's a sense in where, like dreams, but rather than saying, I had a dream, there are times that we are given a dream. There's a difference between that. So the expanded mind, as we were talking about before, can kind of go further than just what we see with our eyes and our ears, right? And so the expanded mind has a sense of like some will call it energy, subtle body, but there's this expansion that takes place that goes beyond just the conscious and the unconscious local mind. And then this area, this represents more of the universal consciousness that can penetrate and that can interact with the conscious mind, the expanded mind, the unconscious. And so experiences, internal experiences that are very real, the sense of autonomous experiences that happen, and all of this falls within universal consciousness. Now, I would also share that when I am assessing psychosis, I look for certain things. And a number of these things are incredibly important. Overall functionality. In other words, I would want to get to know the person. And once I get to know the person, I get to understand, oh, this person seems to function well in life. Outside of this experience where it sort of really shook them, they really function well at their work. They function well in their relationships. They function well in society. So I would look for that overall functionality. I would look for credibility. Like when you know somebody, I know that person, and when they say something, they really mean it. They really believe it. It's true. They have this credibility. Sort of like I think of the people in the military with high clearances who are describing UFOs, unidentified flying objects. They don't know what it is, but they have this credibility that you would know, okay, this isn't something that is really being made up. He's not like that. She's not like that. And then there's skepticism, right? Where you do want to become a bit of a critic, right? Investigators do this, right? They add that sort of skeptical approach. That should not be a threat, right? And so I look for that. Are you able to? And I have met experiencers who are very much like that, where they're like they will even almost willingly discount what they experienced. But skepticism is important. Ken Wilber, who he did a YouTube thing called The Mystic Heart a long time ago. This is really old, but it had some very good information. And he mentioned that mystics are extremely critical when it comes to their experiences. They don't just accept things, hook, line, and sinker. They really are critical, and they take a critical look at what they're experiencing internally. Then there's also a hesitation to tell others, and I've seen this a lot, where people, whether out of fear or whether they just don't want to be thought of as crazy, they just keep it to themselves. That's very different from someone who struggles with, say, mania, right? If you've ever worked with someone who has had a manic episode of some sort, you will see that there's almost like this ego and need of being seen, of being thought of as great, to compensate for the lack that they feel inside. And they'll want to tell you everything. They want you to know how great and mighty they are, right? Or how powerful they feel. But I look for hesitation to tell others. And then there's the discernment to distinguish between a personal inner voice and the transcendent message. Now, this is always good to know. Mediums do this, psychics do this. There's a way in which you want to know, yeah, that's my voice inside. That's how I think. But, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't use that word. I don't speak that way. It felt very not me. And that is an important distinction to make. And then after working with the client, right, the outcome is always important. And I look for the client to become purpose-driven and meaning-making rather than unmotivated. I look for the client to become integrated and unified with self rather than fragmented. And I look for the client to become socially invested rather than isolated. And I'll finish with this. There's another old video. I seem to gravitate to the old videos, but there's an old video by Shunya Yoga, and it's titled Mystic Psychosis and Genuine Mystical Experience. And it's not a lengthy one, but in it he talks about the ability, what makes psychosis from a genuine mystical experience, what makes it different from mystic psychosis. And he points out some very important pieces that I think are very helpful for us as therapists to hear. And he points out to some of these features. There is more of a harmony that develops, that suffering is transforming, that suffering somehow becomes transformational for the person. And so there's purpose and meaning that develops. That's very different from the fragmented self when psychosis is something that occurs, but there's no other reality by which that experience occurred. Okay, so now I am done, Heather, so I'm going to try to see if I can get out of this. Let's see. There I am. Okay.
I was going to say, it pulled off of our side.
But okay, so all right, so I know I said a lot, and I know that there was information that may sound very foreign. I hope to be able to sort of share this more and more with people. This has nothing to do with targeting folks and disrespecting folks, but I think it is fair to critique mainstream psychiatry, especially when it makes claims that it does not really have at the expense of people, including experiencers.
Right.
An advocate
Yeah.
for the experiencer.
Yeah. And you actually said something at one point that triggered a question, and I'm going to read it 'cause it's lengthy, because as you were talking, I was just like writing out everything that was coming to mind. Um, you said we still cannot define a mental disorder. And I wrote, we also can't define the location of consciousness. And for folks out there who aren't aware, the location of consciousness is debatable amongst basically everybody. Some terms: local, meaning is it in the brain? Non-local, is it outside of the brain or body? Then there's another theory of like, is the brain just a receiver, and the consciousness is both local and non-local? But it's a whole other story. But if we can't define a mental disorder, and we cannot define consciousness as to where it is, why do we tend to lean so much toward labeling people with a psychological disorder when they experience phenomena, and not look at the state of consciousness and how someone is experiencing their reality? And what steps does society, need to take to look deeper into people's experiences, and not just label them as it's a psychological disorder?
Right. There's again, that's a dilemma that I find myself struggling when I talk with people about, when I tell experiencers, seek support. Seek support in the mental health field, but the mental health field, mainstream psychiatry, is geared for the very reasons that I showed. It's geared to pathologize the experiencer, because the epistemological approach is bent towards dismissing the immaterial, the unexplained, because mainstream psychiatry has been so strong about demonstrating that it is a medical specialty alongside with physicians, alongside with other medical specialties in the medical science field. They push for that so much, and I don't know. I want to say I have a theory around why, but there is a sense in which, just think about what would happen if mainstream psychiatry let go of that. What do you think? What do you think would happen if they were to say to the public, "We don't know, we don't have a conclusive biological cause to explain depression," even though they throw the serotonin theory around, but that is not conclusive. There have been studies that demonstrate differently, and so whenever you have research, like, I'm not saying that there's not research that might suggest that it is, but whenever you go as far as to say there is a biological cause for depression or for schizophrenia or whatever, you have to have research consistently say that. And it has to be conclusive, so that nothing that comes up again is going to contradict that. And there has been research that says we're not sure. I don't think we can go there. Now, the experiencer, though, has to know that, and that's why I say you need to know how to find somebody who will be sympathetic to you and slow to pathologize, slow to use that kind of language.
We have some questions, Heather.
Okay.
Yep. I know. Antone, welcome to the show, Antone. Kevin, with your background referencing the possibility of communication with the cosmic consciousness, do you have any thoughts on what the components of that transmission medium would be? For example, magnetic, electromagnetic, photonic, some or other unidentified, I'm assuming some or other unidentified energy.
I don't. I think there's a lot of mystery there, and I don't know what it means. Even when I use that model that I showed about universal consciousness, I think what Tiffany was saying is very, very, very important. You hear a lot about universal consciousness, cosmic consciousness. We don't know what that is. We don't know how to describe it. So I don't know what all those pieces are, but what I would say is that in our investigation of that, I want to encourage you to watch the way you process that information, because we are so engulfed as well in the Western epistemological approach that we will look at information and we will investigate in a way that could dismiss another way of understanding consciousness. For example, a lot of cultures talk about having this interconnection, being one with, right? Where time and space dissolve, and there's a sense in which past, present, and future are now, you see? And there's a sense in which if we stick with the Western epistemological approach, we will reduce information and we will seek for either or forms of logic and cause and effect. What about paradoxes? There are some cultures that are comfortable with contradictions. We can't understand it. And in the Western world, we're like, it can't be both. But what is happening? We're using a form of language. We're using symbols to try to explain something that is greater. Of course, we're going to fall into the paradoxes. Of course, we're going to see things as contradictory. Mm-hmm. That's just how things are, because we're trying to understand something greater using these finite symbols called letters that we formulate into words that then have all sorts of associations. Such as if I say God, what is everybody thinking? And so there's a sense in which I want to walk humbly around the exploration of cosmic consciousness. There's so much I don't know about that, but I want to be careful how I approach it.
I think it's really important for people to hear that too. And we have me and Heather talk about Mayim Bialik a lot, because she's, as you know, she's a neuroscientist, and but she's especially lately, she brings a lot of this kind of new age for our era topics to her podcast, and they're topics that would have never been discussed by any scientist just 10 years ago, for that matter. And so it's really important for people, and I commend you for coming on here and saying what you just said, because it's really important for people, especially who are in a specialty field, to say that, to say, I don't know. It's completely okay to not know. And at the same time, you're being open to all of the possibilities.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I think that's it's just important. And I get nervous when we try. Yeah. I get nervous when we try to simplify things. Mm-hmm. Our brains and our minds want to simplify things. That's why I grow cautious with neuroscience. Like when you hear things like, oh, guess what? We don't have a will, because we've noticed that there is something that happens before you actually make the choice. What are we talking about there? And that's where neuroscience is sometimes criticized, because number one, neuroscience is an expensive place. Mm-hmm. And trying to study something, you need a lot of funding. So it's expensive, it's very complex. And one of the areas that neuroscience is criticized is that number one, you you need other disciplines to help you make sense of this whole. The other thing is, when you talk about cause and effect, what makes you think it's just a cause and effect and not a correlation?
Mm-hmm.
Or what makes you think that there's no such thing as participation? Well, we strike that out because there's no such thing as the immaterial.
Mm.
Well, that's how. So if you're going to dismiss something, here comes an experiencer who says, "I felt my mom or my dad in the room last night," right? Or I had an encounter with spirit and I felt them,
Mm-hmm.
or I saw some. That would be really dismissed. Now, some will dismiss it very quickly with a sense of that's pathological. Others will say that's your personal truth.
Mm.
And what they mean is it's like in your head. We're not going to, so I'll help you with it, but it's in your head. No, what about it? What about the external? What about all these experiences that come to us, dreams that are given to us? I love to talk about how some of my ancestors have visited me in a dream. I love to talk about some of these beings that have come to me, and it felt so real and it's so vivid, so different that I say, "Oh, a dream was given to me," i.e., an experience came into my unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And Ginger had one more quick question for you is what are your thoughts on Sheldrake's theory on telepathy?
Ginger, I would have to pause the only thing that I've heard from him has been that whole process of knowing that you're being stared at. And I've had that happen to me, and I don't know, it sounds like it's more common, but in that he does go into really like sophisticated detail that I'm not well versed in. But his focus on the being stared at is really um, it's really to me a very strong suggestion around the expanded mind because there's no sensations. We're not using eyes, we're not using our ears, and you can turn around and before it happens, it's like it happens so fast. You can feel the presence, and there is someone actually looking. I mean, not just but looking. And he goes in and he's written a book around it. But as far, Ginger, as his specifics on telepathy, you may have to teach me on that.
Okay. I don't know if you had any more questions, but he answered all of mine as he carried on with the presentation. The further he got into the presentation, all of my questions before they got answered.
Are you starting to feel, because we touched on the subject of especially in in the science and neuroscience, science across the board, people are especially since people are starting to come forward now. Okay, we have the military, we have as you mentioned, these people who are in you know they have these reputations, you're going to believe them. We have police officers, first responders,
Yeah.
doctors even are starting to have shared death experiences or come forward and share that they've experienced shared death experiences and things like that. So are you starting to believe that there is a big shift coming or starting in terms of how we view consciousness, and how, I guess more importantly, how we view an individual's perception of their reality?
Let's see. Do I think that there is a shift taking?
Yeah. You think you were
I've
starting to
heard,
see that shift?
yeah, I have heard that language. I'm not sure what to do with that, Tiffany, because um, I don't fully understand what that means. There are some that talk about it, And certainly there are more people talking about it. There are more people bold to share their experiences and that sort of thing. I don't know if now, because we are in a day and time where we are more bold to talk about it, that constitutes a shift, because maybe back then they were really, a lot of people had experienced things, but they didn't talk about it, right? It was much more of a taboo than it is today. I don't know what the shift is. I hear a lot too about disclosure and things like that are coming. I'm skeptical around some of that stuff, and especially when it comes to UFO material and the politics that is going on. People are sort of waiting for the big revelation. I just am skeptical around that. I prefer not to get into that aspect of things for sure. But whatever is happening, I want the experiencer to be heard and to be seen and to be honored. Again, I mean, it's not like we closing our eyes and just accepting everything and anything. There are times when people are suffering, and they're suffering in a way that it seems like what they're seeing is real, and it's not. That does happen. But at the same time, I don't care to see someone who has had a genuine experience to be dismissed because of mainstream psychiatry saying that such things do not exist, or all we have is the material, what we can observe. No, there's immaterial things. There are things that are happening, and it's wonderful to empower people in their experiences. It's wonderful to empower their narrative.
So what would that look like? How can mainstream psychology support people, whether they have a diagnosis or they are on medication or not? How can mainstream psychology support an experiencer better?
Well, I would say it would take a lot of shift, because mainstream psychiatry does not have room for the experiencer. He or she will be pathologized, and that's it. See, and that's the struggle that the field, and there are exceptions, but I'm talking about mainstream.
Right.
There are exceptions, but mainstream psychiatry will listen to an experiencer and will dismiss their experiences as something biologically wrong going on in the brain. And it's usually, and it could be anything from some form of psychosis, usually some form of psychosis. And so the experiencer is not validated.
Right.
And because they're not validated, do you think that might prevent some people from coming forward?
So
like to get help?
from coming?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh,
Okay.
yeah. And I mean, you have probably heard of it too, but there have been experiencers who have been hurt by the mainstream psychiatry, psychology, and therapy. They have been hurt by that kind of stuff. And so that's why I had that list of how to sort of go shopping for someone, because you do want them to articulate to you. You want to know that there is someone that has the idea that there's an expanded consciousness of some sort, that these experiences can happen. Right? You don't want somebody just to say, yeah, if I touch this part of your brain, you will believe in.
Yeah.
You don't want that kind of stuff. So I want to know, what do you believe? And if they say that, I go shopping somewhere else. It's important, because otherwise the experiencer will fall into the trap of being pathologized, given a diagnostic code, and maybe even medication.
And then Ginger has a quick question. This maybe a long answer because I know you have a lot of experience in it, but can you talk about end-of-life visioning in hospice? It's so interesting.
That's a wonderful question. Let me see if I could. I worked in hospice for 15 years, and that is actually more common than people might think. But if you've worked in hospice long enough, you will see, patients reaching up or talking. Now, here's what I found out in my experience. I found out, first of all, that the person was reaching out. When the person was reaching out and talking, and sometimes you could hear the mentioning of the name, I would sometimes, because the patient wouldn't be able to do this, I would sometimes ask the family, do you know who George is? Because she was calling George. And it is there that they'll say, oh my, that was my grandfather. Or that was my uncle. The other thing that I noticed around those, they call it deathbed visions. The other thing that I noticed is that most of the time when they were calling somebody or reaching, and I found out from family members who they were, most of the time these people had already passed. It wasn't like they were talking about George and George just left the room. And then the third thing that I found out is, and others people will see this too more so if you work in it, and that is this kind of experience seemed to happen shortly before they pass.
Yeah.
And so now the medical field has its issues as well, and they will understand that as hallucinations, probably drug induced or what have you. I saw so many of them so comforted by the experience. Comforted by the experience. Call it what you will, but if I'm in my deathbed and I have a smile on my face and I call for someone who's passed away and I love, call it what you will. I'm happy.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. I remember I was in the hospital once, and my roommate at the time, she was in hospice, but they brought her in because she broke her leg. And while she was in there, she was talking. And the nurse kept coming in, telling her to be quiet. You have someone else in here. And I'm like, no, she's fine. And she was talking to like a group of people that were there visiting her. And the scariest part was one night when I woke up, I could see them standing there. So I was like, oh, okay, now I know who she's talking to. But she was so happy. She was laughing and having a blast talking to whoever was there watching her. And
That's really neat that you could see them too. That's really. I wonder if that's more common for you, like if you actually can see.
I was there with her for 3 days, and it was only on one night that I woke up and I could see them. And it was just for a short moment, and they kind of faded away, but it was, it kind of was neat to be able to experience what she was experiencing at the same time.
I agree. Yeah. Nice. Yeah.
Anything else, Tiffany? We got about 5 minutes before we need to start wrapping up.
That's all I have. You did a fantastic job in answering and going through everything. So.
Yeah. Thank you again. It was a great presentation. Anything else you want to share that we might have not covered?
No. I think I think I covered everything. And again, I would tell people, if you're a therapist, become very well versed in this area. Not in the name of this thing about if you talk to a colleague, you want to have some good stuff. Not simply, well, they're just not enlightened yet, so they don't understand, and they will kind of stuff. No, you need to give an account. I almost tell people, prepare yourself as if you were to go before the board. How would you explain yourself? They don't have to agree.
Right.
You want to give them some serious stuff.
Yeah.
Right? And then for the experiencer is really, one of my goals is to make sure that you do get the help that you need, right? That you get the support that you need, but that you don't get caught in the trap of pathology.
Mhm.
You need support, you find it,
Mhm.
right? But just understand how the system works, so that you don't get trapped, and then it wounds you.
And it's important for family members and supporters to also understand that and know how to find reliable sources, because a lot of times, especially people dealing with severe mental disorders, they aren't in a place where they can do that. So having a really good advocate, somebody who can speak for you if needed, help you find doctors, is really important.
Oh yes, oh yes, and they're out there. So you just
Mhm.
have to do a little bit of
Yeah.
homework. Once you
Mhm.
hear that they're sympathetic to the experiencer,
Mhm.
it doesn't mean that they that they're not going to do a type of an assessment to make sure that there's no true mental suffering, right? Like that
Right.
something that you need. But at the same time, there are people who like us who want to help and can and do.
Mhm. Mhm. And Anton said, "This is why evidence is so important." Yep.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right.
And one thing I know I want to bring up, because I found it a very fascinating book. I finally got around to reading it, but bring your pen, bring your broom. If you haven't read it, get it.
I'm gonna get it.
I couldn't, the first time we had him on, I couldn't believe I found this while I was researching you. And I just couldn't believe that you wrote a book like that. And I had to go get it. And oh my goodness, I love it.
That
Thank
title
you.
alone is okay. I'm
Thank
going
you.
on Amazon tonight.
Yeah, and that is, it's interesting because that book sort of reflects something that I have to admit to, and that is that many of us who come to this place where we're like questioning mainstream psychiatry, we didn't start off that way. I
Mm.
wrote, and I would literally talk about, you know, mainstream psychiatry and the DSM
Mhm.
in a way that was sort of part of my practice. And now it's very different. So there are a few pages where this is how I used to do it. But for me, it's more now very different, because now I do have a critical eye. And I think mainstream psychiatry is not what it said it is. And I talk to clients about that. But that in that book, I had that old speech of, well, this is what you do. And then if you take medication and you feel good, then it's working. And not that I'm an expert in medication, that takes a whole nother conversation, and that I am not the person to talk to. But there are some good books. Joanna Moncrief, Chemically Imbalanced, is a good book. That one. And there's also another book by Robert Whitaker. He goes deep into some of this stuff, but there's a lot of conversation. And then a good book for people like they call it more of a lay book, but Paula Kaplan was a psychologist and a feminist, and she really advocated for informed consent. And in other words, she advocated for mainstream psychiatry to be open and transparent with patients.
Mhm.
And that's a really good book. It's called They Say You're Crazy by Paula Kaplan.
Oh, I've heard
Really
of
good
that
book.
Yep.
one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. Perfect. But yeah, definitely go get that book. That has my 5-star stamp on it.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody for watching. Again, thank you, Kevin, for joining us. Again, amazing.
Thank you,
We'll
Steve.
definitely have to have you on. So when you have a new presentation, let me know.
I
Would
will.
love to have you back on.
Good to see you,
Yes.
Tiffany. Good to meet you. And thank
Good to meet you.
everybody who really stayed up. I mean, it's 11 o'clock here, but
Yep.
thank everybody who joined us.
Yeah. And anybody catching the end of this, you can always go to Ghost Education Ghost Education 101 on YouTube. The replay will air there, as well as the replay will stay on Facebook for about, what are they keeping them on for 90 days now for the
I think
lives?
so. Yeah.
Yeah. So it'll be there,
Give or
but
take.
otherwise it'll be archived on YouTube. So,
Right.
but Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And as I mentioned earlier, next week we're bringing back Jay. She is coming back on May 6th. Oh my God, I can't believe it's May already. So we can ask the questions we didn't get to ask her when she was on our psychic panel a couple months back. So thank you again, everyone. Y'all have a great night.
Good night.
Bye, guys. Thank you.